There have also always been designers who've chosen to work independently, free from commercial constraints, to pursue different goals. So one example would be the pictorial language, which was produced by the Isotype Institute, first in Austria, then the Netherlands, then in Britain in the early years of the 20th century, to explain complex economic and political developments to people who had difficulty reading and writing. And having used Isotype, this pictorial language, in Europe, they then used it in post-colonial Africa to educate people in areas like Western Nigeria into what the independence in Africa could mean for them. Another great independent design entrepreneur was one of my design heroes, the snowy-haired figure at the back of the photograph. And this is, of course, Buckminster Fuller. And here he is at Black Mountain College in Northern Carolina in the late 1940s, working with the students, where they developed the design formula for his famous geodesic dome. And you can see a model of the geodesic dome in the front of the picture. Now, this has since provided sorely needed shelter for millions of people in desperate circumstances all over the world. Yet despite the efforts of designers like Bucky Fuller and the Isotype Institute, design has continued to be stereotyped as a commercial tool, and as a result has generally been seen as being inferior to art. There were brief periods when it was regarded more favourably in cultural circles. For example, at the end of the 18th century, when the newly built factories in northern England were so fashionable, groups of London intellectuals, artists and socialites used to set off on factory tours of the North and the Midlands. And eminent artists like George Stubbs and John Flaxman designed pottery for industrialists like Josiah Wedgwood, as did socialites like Lady Elizabeth Templetown, whose rather sentimental patterns on his pottery were a huge commercial hit at the time. But this love affair with industrialisation soon waned, and during the 19th century, the stereotype of the dark satanic mill was born. The arts and crafts movement championed a return to the gentler, supposedly purer values of rural craftsmanship, and design was demonized like everything else associated with manufacturing. Now, the tide turned in the early 20th century when the constructivist movement in Eastern Europe championed industrialization as a means of improving the lives of millions of people. And this was a message propagated by constructivist émigrés who moved to Western Europe during the early 20th century, in the 1920s, like the Hungarian constructivist Laszlo Molynárs, who was one of the most famous teachers at the Bauhaus. Now, he believed this: design is an attitude, not a profession, which I think is a brilliant mantra for design today. And here is Molynárs in his uniform. He, as a point of principle, used to wear factory overalls to teach at the Bauhaus every day because he felt this symbolized his belief, his faith in industry and technology. Now, so inspired by his visit to the Bauhaus was one young US architecture student, Philip Johnson, that when he returned to New York, he was charged with setting up the architecture department at the newly formed Museum of Modern Art. He took the very bold step for the time of organizing design exhibitions there too. And one of the first was this one. This is the 1934 exhibition at the Museum of Modern Art, Machine Art, which celebrated the utilitarian beauty of industrial components: ball bearings, gears, pistons, springs, propellers. Johnson began the catalogue with a quote from Plato and appointed a panel of experts, including the aviator Amelia Earhart, to select the most impressive exhibits. Now, this was very radical for the time, when industrial artifacts like these were seen as ugly. They were seen as useful, but that was all. And the New York art critics hated the exhibition. They panned it. But Johnson was undeterred, and he acquired 100 of the exhibits as the core of what is now the world's most prestigious design collection, which is, so they're still part of that collection at the Museum of Modern Art. Now, across the Atlantic here in Europe, other radical curators were starting to explore design too. In Germany, Alexander Dorner experimented with a new approach to the relationship between art, design and architecture at the Landesmuseum in Hanover Andover, where he was director. He used works from its archive to depict the cultural history of particular eras, which included all those disciplines in what he called the atmosphere rooms. And the grand finale was the Room of Today, for which Laszlo Molinage was commissioned to create an immersive sequence of images depicting glimpses of contemporary art, design and architecture, theatre and sport. He also screened experimental films from the time, like Eisenstein's Battleship Potemkin and Vertov's Man with a Movie Camera. And Alexander Dorner also contributed to an equally radical programme of art and design exhibitions in London, organised by the British curator Herbert Reed at the London Gallery during the 1930s. He did exhibitions of artist work, but also of the work of graphic designers and the work of leading constructivists like Laszlo Molinage. Now, he treated design with the same intellectual rigour as he did painting and sculpture, and commissioned eminent colleagues to write essays for his catalogues in the same spirit. Similarly, in the Netherlands, the curator and graphic designer Wilhelm Sandberg championed a very enlightened approach to design, first as a curator and then as director of the Stedelijk Museum in Amsterdam. And Sandberg is still famous there for designing all the graphics that the museum needed during his time as director. And famously, he used to design posters, the invitations, the exhibition openings, the stationery, even the invoices. He often did them during board meetings. And the work that he produced there, which is absolutely beautiful, here's one of the posters he did for a De Stijl exhibition at the Stedelijk Museum, is there and is still part of the collection. And there was another flurry of interest in design among post-war artists like Richard Hamilton in Britain. This is one of his work from the late 1950s, or Ed Ruscha in the United States, when the pop movement emerged. But thoughtful and enlightened though their work was, their interest in design was rooted in consumerism and in deconstructing its power as a commercial tool. And the same can be said of many of the most famous philosophers and writers who analysed design at the time, like Reyner Banham and Roland Barthes. They all saw design as a tool of consumerism. Now, design received similar treatment from modern and contemporary art museums, which were founded in Europe and North America during the post-war period, Moderna Museet in Stockholm and Centre Pompidou in Paris. Mostly they followed Philip Johnson's lead at the Museum of Modern Art in New York by collecting examples of aesthetic excellence in industrial design, like the Eames or Castiglione's furniture, or Brown's consumer electronics. Now, wonderful though such design projects are in many respects, they reinforce the stereotype of design as a commercial discipline. And because of this, it was critiqued very heavily in the late 1960s, particularly by the Arte Povera movement that emerged here in Italy, because Arte Povera artists like Boetti, Fontana and Pistoletto symbolized their contempt for the commercial art market and consumerism, of course, by using cheap or found materials and deliberately fragile, sometimes perishable work. And their concerns were shared by avant-garde architecture groups like Archigram in Britain, Ant Farm in the United States, and Archizoom and Superstudio here in Italy, but also by the Milanese product designer and architect Alessandro Mendini, who translated the Arte Povera spirit brilliantly into furniture design. And this is his Lasso project from 1974. And having made a very simple wooden chair, a sort of generic one, the kind of chair a child might draw, he poured petrol over it and set it alight on a derelict industrial site outside Milan and recorded its destruction on the film. Now, of course, now this looks like a fairly typical conceptual design project for us, but it caused an absolute sensation at the time because the work, the design project, is actually the imagery, it's the film, it's not the object. Now, as a result, and despite the work of Molinage, Isotype, Buckminster Fuller, the Eames, Mendini and others, the general perception of the relationship between art and design could be summed up as follows. Art is good and design is not so good. And an example of this would be the subject of the major exhibition at the Tate Modern Museum in London this spring. And that's the wonderful French artist, or rather Russian artist, though she lived and worked in France, Sonia Delaunay. Now, her work was deeply unfashionable for many years, and she was pretty much overlooked by the art world, largely because she diversified into fashion design during the 1920s. These are some of the swimsuits that she designed then. She set up a fashion house in Paris, and she designed both clothing and textiles, and this is all beautifully displayed at Tate Modern. But it's only recently, as cross-disciplinary work has become more fashionable, that the art world has taken Sonia Delaunay seriously. Because up until recently, art, or so the not-so-good argument went, was considered to be culturally superior to design. And this was on the assumption that artists are free to express whatever they wish, in whichever form they choose, often in work they make themselves, whereas designers are subject to numerous constraints, the demands of their clients, ensuring that their work fulfills a particular function, to forfeiting control of the outcome by delegating production elsewhere. Now, of course, many designers are indeed inhibited by those constraints, and weaker designers fail to overcome them, while gifted artists exercise their right to self-expression by articulating ideas that the rest of us struggle to voice. But of course, weaker artists do nothing of the sort and compromise themselves by pandering to the commercial demands of the market. Yet designers are often depicted as aspiring to be akin to artists and for their work to be described as artistic or sculptural. If you look at the reviews of the Alexander McQueen retrospective at the Victoria and Albert Museum in London, if you have a chance, I'd urge you to go and see it. Like the Sonia Delaunay show, it's an absolutely wonderful exhibition. This is in the Cabinet of Curiosities area of the show, where they have videos of his fashion shows and the work that he and his collaborators produced. The adjective artistic crops up again and again in what are generally hugely positive reviews of the show. And I think this is very insulting, because Alexander McQueen was a brilliant designer of clothes, and he should be celebrated for that, not to be patronized for being a wannabe artist, because that wasn't what he was. However, by reinforcing the shallow stereotypes about design, it distracts society's attention from its more important applications, possibly preventing us from realizing its full potential. If you draw a parallel with healthcare, if a hospital decided that its staff would just treat physical problems and not psychological ones, it's pretty obvious that it wouldn't be treating its patients properly. And similarly, if you only think of design as being a superficial styling tool, why on earth would governments, businesses, banks and NGOs think that it might be helpful to make a constructive contribution to addressing the environmental crisis or producing ingenious solutions to social problems? They wouldn't. But I would argue there's never been a better time to make the case for design to fulfill that wider role, because of the schismic changes in its culture and practice that I believe are as dramatic as those that transformed the role of art a century ago. Because thanks to the liberating power of digital technology and their own determination, designers have become increasingly independent and entrepreneurial in defining their own objectives and executing them on their own terms rather than under instruction from their clients. In other words, they've freed themselves from the constraints that have led to design being seen in such a stereotypical way. Now, many designers are using that freedom to address what The Economist calls the big problems, often in collaboration with scientists, social scientists, programmers, economists, and other specialists, who are also increasingly applying design principles in their own work. In many ways, I think design is increasingly returning to its old pre-industrial guise. There are lots of great examples, but here are a few of my favorites. This is a picture of the research work that was done by a social design group in Britain. It's called Participle, and it's based in London. Now, Participle is devoted to redesigning areas of social services that need reinventing. And this was a project they undertook for a local council to redesign their provision of care for the elderly. And of course, the rapidly expanding elderly population is a massive social, political, and economic problem for developed economies all over the world. Their challenge was to find a more efficient way for the local council to provide care for the elderly that cost no more than the existing service. And Participle developed what it called the circles. This was a series of sort of membership clubs, self-help groups and concierge services that local elderly people belonged to. They would use their skills and experience and knowledge to help other people in the circle, and also would actually, by being part of the circle and by talking to fellow members about the help that they needed, they would have a much more tailored package of care from the local authorities. So, for example, and at the risk of gender stereotyping, if a man's wife had died recently, like my father, where my mother sadly died, and he was unable to cook because he had refused to do so for many years, another member of the circle might come and help him to learn how to do basic cookery, whereas he might be able to help somebody else to, say, use the internet or to garden or just sit in with them to make them feel more comfortable if a plumber or an electrician came to call. The circles have been so successful that they've been introduced to 12 different local councils throughout Britain and have since been adopted in other countries too. There's also a fantastic new genre of social designers and design entrepreneurs emerging in Africa, and this is one of them, Eco-Fuel Africa, which was founded in Uganda, and this was set up by a Ugandan design entrepreneur called Sanga Moses. And he designed a way and designed the necessary equipment to enable farmers to turn their agricultural waste into organic charcoal briquettes, which could be used as cheap, accessible, clean cooking fuel by people all over southern Uganda. And the difficulty of obtaining cooking fuel in deforested areas like rural Uganda is a massive problem. It means that people, typically women and girls, have to spend many hours a day foraging for fuel, and often they end up cooking with dirty fuel. And the deaths from toxic cooking fuel total 1.5 million around the world every year. It's a massive health problem. So Eco-Fuel Africa, which tens of thousands of people all over Uganda is now using, has huge economic benefits for the farmers who sell hitherto valueless agricultural waste, for the new enterprises that are set up to turn the waste into briquettes and to sell them. It also helps the people who buy the cooking fuel, because people no longer have to miss work or school in order to find it, and it has huge health and environmental benefits. Another very inspiring African project is this. This is in Cameroon. It's an Internet of Things healthcare device which a young software designer called Arthur Zhang developed. It's called the CardioPad, and it's basically a tablet computer that he has adapted. Cameroon does not have a very sophisticated healthcare system, and it can't afford to construct one. And so he has developed this device so that people can be tested by the device in their local hospitals, and the information is then sent over a normal cellular network to the main hospital, research hospitals in the Cameroonian capital, where they have the sophisticated equipment that's required to analyze it, then sent back to the local hospital. So in other words, it enhances the efficiency of the local hospitals hugely.